Okay, before we start this video with Dr. Peterson talking about historical facts about Dokdo and Korea, if you've watched my channel before, you might know that I have a lot of interest in Dokdo. And so as I started to study about Dokdo, I started to realize why Dokdo is valuable and important and why it's so important to the Korean people. I also think Dokdo is representative of a lot of the history between Korea and Japan. So this first part is just showing Dokdo clearly belongs to Korea. And in my other videos, I talk about why I'm interested, why it's important. But in this video, we talk about the facts of Dokdo and why historically Dokdo belongs to Korea. So I hope you enjoy it. Hi everybody, I'm Chad. This is Professor Dr. Mark Peterson.
Hello everyone, good to see you again.
Here from the Frog Outside the Well channel. Good to be back together.
Yeah, you've been busy.
Been busy. Yeah, life's been a little crazy. And ready to talk about more Korea.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about Dokdo.
Dokdo's the topic today.
Dokdo's an interesting topic. And this is something I've mentioned before in my videos, and I fully admit that when I first heard about Dokdo, I thought, what's the big deal? Right? That was my first thought.
Yeah.
Because I really didn't know a lot about it. And in fact, it wasn't until I returned back from Korea and heard a little bit more about it, I was like, I want to do some investigating for myself, figure out why Koreans care so much about it.
Yeah. Why they build replicas of it and put in the subway stops in various places.
This video is sponsored by Facts Korea. So their job basically is to make sure that the correct facts are coming out about Korean historical issues such as Dokdo or other things. So that's what we're talking about.
And Facts Korea does a great job.
They do.
They weed out a lot of phony stuff that's out there.
So that's the nice thing about making a video like this, is that if we say anything incorrect, they're going to review it and they're going to say, hey, this is actually not correct. We're in the business of spreading facts. So if you have anything that you would like to be reviewed by Facts Korea, we'll have some information below where you can submit it, or if you want to find out more about what they do, check it out below. But basically, I think a very important mission to make sure that the things that we're talking about are factually true.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into some of the history of Dokdo, but I'm curious, what's your thoughts on why is Dokdo so important?
Well, it symbolically represents the Japanese past and Japanese relations with Korea.
Right.
Which have not been happy.
Right.
Going back to when Japan invaded Korea in 1592 and killed millions of people, somewhere between 2 and 4 million people, ruined the land, burned everything that could be burned. Japan did that. The late 1800s and annexed Korea in 1910.
Right.
Controlled Korea as a colony, and it really turns ugly as Japan builds into World War II.
Right.
As Japan tries to conquer China and can't do it, they just murder a lot of Chinese, and it's just really a senseless, awful experience. And there's a lot of resentment toward Japan, even today, because of the history. And so symbolically, Ulleungdo represents the last vestige of Japan's control, unrighteous, illegal control of Korea. So the Koreans are saying, Japan, you ain't coming back. We're not going to put up with that again.
Yeah.
The symbolism of it starts with Ulleungdo.
Yeah.
Ulleungdo is Korean land,
and
we're claiming that. And if you come any farther than that, then it's not going to work.
Right. So my thought initially, okay, this is about fishing rights. This is about natural resources, things like that. I do think that's part of it.
That's part of it.
But I do think the big part of it is what you're talking about, and sending a message to Japan. It's like, we're not going to be pushed around. We're not your little brother. You can't come in and just take whatever you want. Yeah. And I think that's important. I don't think that there's any reason to minimize that side of it. I think as a country, you have to have, your country pride, your self-respect, and defending what is yours.
Yeah. And Ulleungdo is a great symbol of that, of Koreans' independence. On the other hand, Japan's unwillingness to recognize the awful things they've done in the past. Right. Japan, for example, on the comfort women issue, says, well, we apologize about that, as if that's the end of it.
Right.
But then they turn around and say, but they were mostly prostitutes anyway, weren't they?
Right.
And they get this guy at Harvard Law School to say, yeah, it was a legal arrangement.
Exactly.
A totally phony presentation that he made. For Japan to say, we apologize once and then they unapologize, it just doesn't work. So Korea has a lot of distrust for Japan.
Yeah. Dokdo, Ulleungdo, I think it's part of a bigger issue and a deeper relationship than just, the land itself, I guess.
Yeah. Symbolically, it means a lot. Japan could really make a lot of positive mileage out of this thing if they would just say, hey, we're sorry for all the bad things that have happened in the past. We don't want to fight about these things. We want to be a good neighbor. Hey, Dokdo is yours. And from now on our Japanese maps, we're not going to call it Takashima. We're going to call it Dokdo.
Right.
And let's be friends and forgive and forget. And, Koreans go a long way toward forgiving and forgetting. I mean, after all of the things that the Japanese have done. There's the Hideyoshi invasion, millions killed. The takeover of Korea by force in 1910, colonizing Korea, Japan owning Korea. Then in the middle of that, they have a lot of poor Korean laborers come to
Japan.
cruddy jobs in Japan.
Right.
And so there are a bunch of them living in Tokyo. Well, there's this big earthquake called the Kanto earthquake. Kanto is the Tokyo area. And they used that, the Japanese used that as their excuse to retaliate against the Koreans. They had little complaints about Koreans. I mean, they got all these poor Koreans. Maybe there was some robbery, maybe there's some bad things that goes on, maybe there's some fights or something that goes on, among people. But the Japanese used this earthquake as the excuse to go in and slaughter a bunch of these Koreans.
Okay.
They just up and killed about 6,000 Koreans.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And, Koreans don't complain about that as much as they should. I mean, it's just one of the long list of things. Symbolically, Dokdo represents all this bad blood.
I think you're totally right. It's, Japan, one could probably do themselves a favor in terms of smoothing over some past things by admitting it. But on top of that, what's interesting to me is that I don't see the reason. I don't, why are they holding on to this? Yeah. Right. I've looked through a lot of things historically. I know that you know a lot historically on it. It's just mountains and mountains of evidence of Dokdo originally belonging to Korea. It's like the comfort women issue. That I don't understand the denialism. I don't understand the making excuses. And I don't understand why they just don't go along with it and accept it. As this is being sponsored by Facts Korea, we want to make sure we're presenting some facts along with our thoughts. And I think mostly we have.
Yeah.
But a couple of things I just wanted to touch on. One is in 1693, there was a fisher, An Young-bok, I believe was his name. And he was actually taken captive by the Japanese in a dispute between fishers from Korea and Japan. An Young-bok eventually returned to Korea and gives a statement basically saying okay, Japan has now admitted that, Dokdo, Ulleung-do, this area, in fact, belongs to Korea, right? And on top of that, Japanese shogunate, the leadership at the time, basically tells their people, hey, that fishing area, that is off limits to you. And in fact, there was somebody, a smuggler, so it wasn't just that he was fishing over there, but it was a smuggler who went into that area, who wasn't supposed to, in fact, was executed by Japan.
All for violating territorial waters.
In part for violating territorial waters. I'm sure the smuggling had something to do with it as well. Yeah. But there was strict punishments in place for those who violated and went into that area.
So Japan recognized...
so at least in 1693, there is this evidence that's piled up, right? But then they go back, actually, that's not valid because of this, this, and this.
Yeah, it's really a pain. That's why, in spite of the historical facts, I like to argue that the symbolic value of Dokdo is the important thing. And as long as both countries are at loggerheads over claiming it and do so from a symbolic point of view, we're not going to get anywhere.
Right.
But which side would gain by surrendering and recognizing the other side?
Right.
Japan would lose almost nothing and gain everything in the world by saying, hey, Korea, those are your islands. We're not going to contest it anymore. Let's be good neighbors.
Exactly.
They could make a lot of mileage out of that. But are they going to do it?
No, probably not.
It ain't going to happen.
So one thing that you mentioned, talking about, kind of the maps that didn't include Dokdo or Ulleung-do, the Japanese maps that didn't include them as Japanese territory. So there was, I don't know the pronunciation of it properly, the Daijokan, 1877 Japanese historical document. So they're basically putting this together, basically a consensus of
a lot of Japanese history, and they go to the top organization, basically the top governing organization in Japan, and they're like, hey, what about Dokdo? What about Ulleungdo? Like, you know, using their own names for it, I'm sure. Do we include these? And the quote that they get back, they say, Dokdo and Ulleungdo are Korean territory and both regions have nothing to do with Japan.
Yeah.
I mean, that's as clear as it gets. As clear as it gets. Korean territory and nothing to do with Japan. So they weren't included in that historical document.
Well, and that's just another rock on the pile of evidence
Right.
that it really belongs to Korea. You know, I mentioned the Cairo conference documents, and they've been reneged on and argued again. And the American government has taken the position that they don't want to decide,
Right.
that it's a matter for the two countries to decide.
Right.
Which means there needs to be a decision.
Right.
Which means one side has to say, yes, those are your islands.
Right.
And Korea's not going to do it.
No.
Never, never.
Nor should they.
And they've occupied it.
Yeah. That's the other part of it too. I mean, to say nothing of that Koreans have lived on Dokdo, right? That they have people there, that it's been occupied and controlled by Korea for so long.
Yeah. Well, of course, the Japanese argue that they're really unoccupiable rocks. There's no water there. And in the land of the sea, in the laws of the sea, you can't claim unoccupied rocks as territory. That's the Japanese argument. But the Koreans have put in a dock, make it easy to get in and out. They've got people living there. We're stuck with this dispute. And the only way to resolve it, is for Japan to be magnanimous and say, hey, those are your islands.
It just reminds me so much of the comfort women issue, where the evidence is there.
Yeah.
It's clear, but rather than accepting what the evidence says, accepting what the facts are, accepting what the history is, Japan instead fights it. And they just fight.
Yeah. Denial,
and
denial,
I don't understand why.
Yeah. Image.
Yeah.
Japan is really, and they say so. They talk about this being a matter of image, but it's the only solution.
Yeah.
The only solution would be for Japan to say, hey, we want peace in the world. We're not going to fight over this.
Yeah.
And they refuse to do it.
So maybe someday we get there, but until then, I guess we'll keep sharing the facts surrounding Dokdo.
Thanks, Korea.
Yeah. So thanks for being on here. I love to have your input.
It's always good to do videos with you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So more coming down the road. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye.
See ya. Bye.